Coming up on BBC London News, plans which could see 25,000 more flights from Heathrow. Some residents aren't happy.
Very bad for sleep. Sometimes the planes come in at 5 o'clock, so it does wake you up, it affects your sleep.
We'll hear from Heathrow bosses and get the latest on tonight's disruption after reports of a drone.
Here's the BBC covering proposals to significantly increase the number of flights handled by Heathrow Airport each year. The report forms part of the BBC Evening News for the London and South East region on January the 8th. See if you can spot the missing news angle.
A very good evening to you and welcome to the programme. First tonight, as we've been hearing this hour, there has been some flight disruption from Heathrow this evening while police investigate reports of a drone sighting. We'll bring you an update on that in just a moment. But it comes on the day the airport unveiled plans to be able to run 25,000 more flights each year. That's before a third runway is built. There's been a mixed reaction to the proposal, as our transport correspondent Tom Edwards reports.
Even before a third runway, Heathrow wants to increase the number of flights. It'll mean changes to flight paths, and some parts of the capital could get planes overhead for the first time.
It's very irritating and very frustrating.
Does it wake you up? Does it wake you up, the noise?
In the mornings, yes. Yes. Very bad for sleep.
Laurie Anders lives under the flight path in Chiswick. Any increase in planes would not be welcome.
I think it would be noisier, and I think it would be more consistently noisier, and I think also that the respite periods would be less.
Oh well, so far so good.
Heathrow wants to add 25,000 flights a year. That would mean a total of 500,000 flights. If a third runway is given planning permission, it would increase again to 750,000 flights a year. What Heathrow wants to do is land more planes on the existing two runways. At the moment, they have to stagger the landings when they do it. What they want to do is something called independent parallel approaches. That means basically land the planes at exactly the same time. With a third runway, the airport also wants to hear from Londoners about flight paths, noise and night flights and how they should be managed.
But apparently not on anything else.
It says it wants to increase the number of flights responsibly.
When you make changes to airspace, there will be winners and losers, but we must remember that there are people who will get less noise than today. And overall, following an expanded Heathrow in a few years' time, we will have less noise impact on our local communities than we do today.
At this solicitor's in Staines, they welcome expansion both short and long term at Heathrow.
25,000 more flights, whilst you have to be sensitive towards the environmental and noise pollution aspects.
Sensitive, but not for very long, eh?
It's good for business at all levels. It's good for Spelthorne residents. It's good for those that are employed by the Heathrow village that live within Spelthorne and the 5 boroughs that abut Heathrow. And it's good for Great Britain plc. And in times of economic uncertainty, with Brexit round the corner, that can only be good for us.
Any increase is up to government, who cap the number of flights at Heathrow. The consultation lasts until March.
Well, that was entertaining, particularly that bit about UK PLC and how the expansion of Heathrow could only be good for everybody. So, I mean, this report, I have to say, is sort of characteristic of the piss-poor standard of journalism that you get from the BBC. The missing news angle, just in case you hadn't guessed, is climate change and our contribution to it through our carbon emissions. Now, the aviation industry makes a significant contribution to our global carbon emissions, plus the nitrous oxides released by traffic travelling to and from airports. And then, of course, you've got the water vapour trails in the sky, which also contribute to global warming. And so it comes as, you know, if you consider that the IPCC said just a few short weeks ago that we have 12 short years to get our arses into gear on this and start to wean ourselves off the burning of fossil fuels, you know, it seems to be a bit bizarre that the BBC didn't even mention this angle in a news report about a major expansion of Heathrow Airport. I mean, I suppose, to be fair to the BBC, it's an easy mistake to make. Climate change is only considered to be the greatest existential threat to humanity possibly ever. And you see, one of the things I find particularly galling about the BBC's coverage is that on the one hand, they will wheel out someone like David Attenborough to tell us about how we're going to hell in a handcart. But what they don't do, generally, is reveal the climate change angle in everyday lives. The news agenda is centred around inconvenience and noise to local people, which frankly must be truly hideous. I couldn't live next to an airport. And business. Now, the problem with allowing that businessman solicitor to talk the way he did completely unchallenged is that there's a very significant part of the business community that lives in a hermetically sealed parallel universe that excludes any consideration of the costs of doing business, or many of those costs. And climate change and carbon emissions are certainly one of those costs, particularly when it comes to aviation. This is a really big problem because it's also reflected in economic theory, in that economists will regularly externalise costs like climate change and health issues and all sorts of stuff, simply because it's not part of the business model, even though many of those costs derive directly from that business activity. And the thing is, one would have thought that the BBC would have got out of this sort of complacent and rather lazy groupthink to start challenging this and actually adding the climate change perspective even to schemes like this in the local news. Because after all, if a publicly funded public service broadcaster like the BBC cannot do this, then how can we expect anyone else to?